Without much ado, we would like to invite Dr. Sharda as the first speaker on selection of patients for CRT.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the third day of the ACVS conference. Thank Dr. Srinivas Kumar for giving me the opportunity to be here to interact with you all. Respected chairpersons and dear friends, the talk given to me today is to talk in the next 20 minutes on steps to identify a good responder for CRT. Classical AHA indications for cardiac resynchronization therapy are that patients with heart failure should have a LV ejection fraction less than 35%. They should be in ambulatory class 3 or 4 status. QRS duration should be more than 120 milliseconds. This is on optimal medical therapy. So if you see, it comes way in the middle, not in class 1, not in class 2. It comes with significant symptoms. That is important and has a bearing on the response, because when they are significantly symptomatic, they perceive the response better. That is subjectively, and objectively trials have shown significant mortality benefit only in symptomatic heart failure, considering that there are significant risks in implantation of a CRT which cannot be taken lightly. And again, to bear on it from epidemiological perspective, heart failure deaths progressively increase as the symptomatic status worsens, and you see that from the orange sector is the one with heart failure. In class 2 symptoms, it's just 12%, and then moving on to class 3 status, it becomes 1/4 of the patients have death due to heart failure, and moving on to class 4, more than 50% have they die due to heart failure. So this has a bearing in significantly symptomatic patients that you would like to implant a CRT to first improve on the functional status, and number 2, to improve on the mortality. So to focus on today's topic in view of the time which I thought was limited, now that it seems to be expanding a little bit more, is a good responder to cardiac resynchronization therapy for a clinician is a patient with heart failure, severe ventricular left ventricular systolic dysfunction. Please make an attempt and do workup to exclude all reversible causes of heart failure, which would definitely mean ruling out significant ischemic heart disease. Not uncommonly, we find that hibernating myocardium with severe ventricular dysfunction, when it's missed or when you actually address it, patient can have significant improvement in ventricular function by revascularization. And also exclude significant comorbid illnesses which limit survival to less than 1 year. This would mean any significant malignancies, etc., which would limit patients' survival. So in my view, this is the way I would approach, and this would reasonably address how a clinician would approach a heart failure patient when he is looking for whether or not to implant an expensive device, whether the risks of the procedure would weigh in terms of benefit rather than a predominant risk. So one is that you assess that the patient is actually symptomatic despite being on optimal medication. Optimal medication as AHA includes diuretics, ACE inhibitors or ARBs, beta blockers, and perhaps spironolactone. The usual armamentarium, all the drugs have to be on optimal doses, and still the patient continues to have class 3 or class 4 symptoms, and he is ambulatory. When you have such a patient, next step is to look at the ECG, where the QRS duration, these are the classical indications, QRS duration has to be equal or more than 120 milliseconds, because classical definition of dyssynchrony still relies on the electrical dyssynchrony. And so you look at the QRS duration, which has to be equal to or more than 120 milliseconds. Studies are very, very controversial in narrow QRS, so we will stick to guidelines, try not to go beyond guidelines while a clinician has a liberty to do so. And certainly please look at the PR interval. PR interval more than 210 milliseconds or first degree AV block is something which would make a patient become a responder to CRT. After looking at the ECG, we'll discuss all this a bit more in detail in the next few slides, just giving you a bird's eye view as to what would be the steps. Step 3 is to check the echo, confirm that the LV ejection fraction is severely depressed, that is equal to or less than 35%. There is evaluate for the severity of mitral regurgitation, rule out mitral valve intrinsic problems, so valve prolapse or a papillary muscle dysfunction. So easiest way to evaluate that is the MR is functional. That to say that the MR is functional is that it's usually a central jet. Then even on the echo you can make out if there are scars or no scars. Ventricular thinning to less than 5 millimeters ventricular wall in diastole would mean that that area is not viable. That's a simple echo measurement. So apart from such a measurement, if you actually have gross thinning, especially globally, yes, and especially in the posterolateral segment where the LV lead would be put in, that's something that you look out, because you know that if there is such a scar in the area subtended by the LV lead, this patient may not be a responder. Step 4 is to subject the patient for more detailed analysis of the dyssynchrony. The most easiest and the most commonly done way is by echocardiography, by a tissue Doppler assessment, where you check for interventricular and more importantly intra-left ventricular dyssynchrony. And step 5, which I have added and which is recommended now after the PROSPECT trial, is to do a CT imaging prior to implant. This gives us significant information as to quantifying the extent of scar globally, telling us information about the scar in the posterolateral LV, whether it's transmural, subendocardial, all the details. And more important and very important is a CT coronary angiogram, which shows the venous phase, will show us if there is a suitable vein in the intended area, which is definitely important, because for the operator that would mean greatly, it would tell us whether a endocardial placement would be successful or not. And after all this is when you actually implant the lead, you need to achieve an optimal lead placement in the last area, in the area which is activated the last in the LV, and it should be viable. Doing all this would make us definitely contribute to making the patient respond to a device which is expensive. To dissect a few more of these individual components, let's go through the theoretical aspects. Dyssynchrony, classically as defined still by AHA, is an electrical dyssynchrony. That is, there's a conduction delay. There's an intraventricular conduction delay which makes the QRS more than 120 milliseconds. But as I've elaborated before, we also need to look at the AV dyssynchrony as illustrated by a prolonged PR interval. But more important, and to be corroborated for the electrical dyssynchrony and to identify a good responder, is mechanical dyssynchrony, wherein there is a segmental delay in contraction and relaxation between the various segments of the left ventricle, and this is a very good predictor of response to CRT. And by both these means, both electrical and mechanical dyssynchrony, it's well shown in studies that the more the dyssynchrony, more is the response to a proper resynchronization. That is, when a LV lead is placed appropriately in the segments which are contracting late, the response is that much more better. QRS duration in studies has been shown to correlate with mortality. The more broader the QRS, the worse is the mortality, compared to a person with less than 90 milliseconds LV dysfunction. A person with 220 milliseconds QRS duration has 5 times more mortality. And how prevalent is a wide QRS in a patient with heart failure? Electrical dyssynchrony, that is QRS widening, is not insignificant. So it varies anywhere between 30 to 55% in various studies. And by QRS width, it's well shown that the more wider it is, the better is the response to CRT. If you see here in these graphs, the white area is the non-responders. Non-responders are least in QRS duration between 145 to 160 and 160 to 80, and but even otherwise, even that compared to ones which are less than 140 milliseconds, the ones which are beyond are certainly having less non-responders. So while we say that QRS duration 160 or more is better, it's a gradation. Coming to PR interval, why is it important, and why correcting this contributes to patient responding favorably to CRT is because one thing is lack of appropriate atrial kick leads to loss of decrease in 30% of cardiac output straight away in these dysfunctional ventricles which are heavily dependent on an appropriate preload. And occurrence of diastolic MR, I'll be showing you slides. These are important. Whenever there is a phase lag between the atrial systole and then the ventricular systole, there's a period of stasis there, which leads to the mitral valve, AV valves being open, and that leads to diastolic mitral regurgitation, which takes away an important preload and contributes to symptoms being much more, and decreases the cardiac output. So this is one way of looking at the diastolic MR. This is the E and A wave, and then just this is a systolic mitral regurgitation on a pulse wave Doppler. You can see that there is this looks like tiny. This look like less, but that's enough to tilt balances between an appropriate preload and not. After CRT, you can see that this same patient has no diastolic mitral regurgitation with an appropriate lengthening in the filling time. Now, coming to QRS widening, what is the problem? Why it leads to decrease in cardiac output, and how correction of it, an electrical correction would lead to improvement in cardiac output is by various means. Whenever this is cardiac MR imaging showing, cardiac MR imaging showing the dysynchrony, which is very obvious. This is a synchronized as this is all in very visually appreciative is the significant dysynchrony on MR. And so when it is like this, you can clearly appreciate that the output will be totally inadequate, because as one segment is moving in, the other segment is moving out of phase, and so that leads to inadequate cardiac output. Then that also leads to a prolonged duration of mitral regurgitation, because part of the AV valve is kept. So the QRS duration, you can see that there's a significant interventricular, there's a QRS widening, which makes the LV contract later, because there's a left bundle branch block pattern. Predominantly studies have addressed LBBB pattern. When we say interventricular conduction defect, the RBBB patterns have been minority in studies, about 10%. So when we address this issue of interventricular conduction, we usually mean that we're talking of a left bundle branch block, which makes segments of left ventricle contract much later and out of sync with the rest of the LV. So RV contracts and RV relaxes appropriately. The LV contraction starts late, and then there is very little time for relaxation. All this leads to impinging on the filling time, and so this leads to decreased ventricular filling. The septum moves paradoxically because part of the RV is contracting earlier, and this leads to prolonged duration of MR. So how do we assess this mechanical dysynchrony? As we already alluded to, the most easiest way is by echo, conventional echo or tissue Doppler echo. MR definitely gives us information. The only limitation being that we can't do a follow-up MR after CRT in general to assess for resynchronization, but pre-procedure MRI gives excellent information about scar, about dysynchrony in general, and other ways of eliciting those are by RNV and cardiac cath. Conventional echo, let me restate what I already said briefly, is to assess global systolic function. You assess the by modified Simpson's rule, by M mode, by various parameters, various ways of confirming that the LV ejection fraction is actually 35% and less. Look out for akinetic areas which are there, scar areas globally and especially posterolaterally, the area which is subtended by the LV lead. And definitely look at the severity of mitral regurgitation and the cause, whether it's organic or functional, because functional MRs respond best to CRT. Also on conventional echo, what we rely quite severely, even if we don't have an immediate access to tissue Doppler, is this delayed contractility of the posterior wall, LV posterior wall in M mode, the usual PLAX view. You find that when it's delayed, the criteria is that it should be delayed 130 milliseconds or more, but even if you don't have that particular duration, compared to the peak systolic septal inward motion, if the LV posterior wall is moving later, not only later, it's impinging on this is the mitral valve opening in its typical W pattern, and if this is impinging on the peak mitral valve opening, that's significant dysynchrony, and pre-exciting this area by an LV lead would improve the LV filling and optimize the cardiac output for this patient. That's a simple way of assessing a responder to CRT. It's also important to check for interventricular mechanical delays on conventional echo. You can just, it's a very simple thing when you have a QRS, the onsets of pulmonary wave and pulmonary flow and aortic flow, if they're significantly delayed, if it's more than 50 milliseconds. Usual criteria that normally the entire heart should contract within 40 milliseconds of each other. So if it's more than 40, that itself is a criteria for dysynchrony. The more delayed, the better it is for responding to CRT. Also, we take help of this to when we resynchronize the patient and we want to optimize cardiac output, we check on the interventricular dysynchrony. As long as there is no significant RV dysfunction, when we adjust the VV delays appropriately to make interventricular delay less than 50, patients feel better. Tissue Doppler is definitely the main way of assessing for, or the easiest way practically to do for assessing for dysynchrony, to check for responders, because again, as I stress, when the electrical dysynchrony is alone taken into, the responder rates are significant, about 50% to 50% or so, which will improve significantly if you take a mechanical dysynchrony as an additional collaborative finding. And so this is offline analysis when you do a simultaneous acquisition of a sample placed in the basal septum, basal lateral wall, and you get the curves with a delay, which the delay again, as I said, more than 40 is enough to diagnose dysynchrony. The more later, the better. This is pre-procedure in the patient, and the same patient post-procedure, the curves really hugging. You can also do it.
You must watch out the time.
Sure, thanks. I was just told to stretch out, so that's why I'm. You can do it online too, and then you can assess not only the left ventricular dysynchrony, you can also make an assessment of the interventricular dysynchrony on tissue Doppler by placing a sample volume in the RV free wall. These are really important predictors of reverse remodeling. Again, I stress that having these dysynchrony and parameters makes you more stronger in recommending a CRT device. Strain rates on tissue Doppler can differentiate scar from viable area very nicely, so they collaborate. MR and CT imaging for dysynchrony are good. Cardiac cath was being done once upon a time, so I thought I'll just show you when a patient has LV lead, the wedge pressures are very low, cardiac output is good, and when there is no pacing, you can see the wedge pressures really shooting up with a fall in systolic pressure and narrowing of pulse pressure. CT imaging is important, again to collaborate, it will give us the extent of the scar. If more than 50% of LV has scar, that patient is not likely to respond to CRT. Also, if even if it is less than 50% globally, if there's a scar beneath the LV lead, look at this. This is the way our LV lead would go. You would certainly not expect this to contract at all. So it's a waste of placing the LV lead there. So that would predict for a poor response to CRT. And again on venous phase, if you can see that there is no vein subtending this area, then maybe you would take care of, you would plan electively for an epicardial approach by a surgeon. So it really helps. This is a significant scar in the posterolateral area. So this is from the prospect study. What was suggested is that when you have a heart failure patient eligible for CRT with classical indications, dysynchrony as assessed by mechanical segmental lag, if it is there, they are responders. If the scar tissue in LV lead, if there is extensive scar, more than 50% of LV, and you are unable to place the LV in the intended area, all this would portend to a poor responder. Once you exclude, this is to be done when you exclude all reversible cause of heart failure and significant comorbid illnesses limiting survival to less than 1 year. Thank you.
Thank you. One thing I wanted to just make a comment is, one thing is responder is a very general term, I agree. There could be a responder by means of QRS duration, by tissue Doppler dysynchrony, or by symptomatic status, or by echocardiography. It's a heterogeneous territory. Second thing is, CRT prospects are over a period of time have been not very encouraging, because we don't have good data for patients with AF, RBBB, narrow QRS, and now with MRI, as you have shown, if you have a scar, you really don't have a good response. Any comments you can make on these two things?
I just kept out of the controversial areas. Narrow QRS studies are definitely, as clinicians, we have done when the PR interval is prolonged, we thought patient will benefit. Some of them have, some of them have not. So narrow QRS certainly is not one of those that you would both respond and rethink, made us think differently. So we don't have firm guidelines in narrow QRS as yet. Atrial fibrillation, yes, studies are still, though it's well shown that once you ablate and pace, it's well shown that it will benefit, but as such in AF with a varying, because that's one thing which will limit CRT efficacy, because varying RR intervals will make all the time LV capture less. So whenever the LV capture is less, it's less than 100%, your response to BIV is less. RBBB is a good pointer. We have in the original studies, Mustic and Miracle, we had about 10 to 15% patients had right bundle branch block. They said it's similar in benefit, but we are finding more and more that RBBB patients, when they have an extreme axis deviations, they are more likely. Studies definitely have not. The robust data is for LBBB. There is definitely, as pointed out, RBBB, we do implant when there is a mechanical dysynchrony. Please, that definitely helps us to collaborate that some patients with RBBB definitely have a mechanical dysynchrony in the left ventricle, especially the ones with an extreme axis when the posterolateral LV, definitely, especially left posterior hemiblock kind of pattern, the posterolateral LV where you put the LV lead, that activates very late, those patients can benefit. So that's how the importance of substantiating your electrical dysynchrony with mechanical dysynchrony to improve your responder rate.
Thank you, Dr. Sharda.